Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webcast. My name is Mike Otranto, and I'm a strategic account specialist at Wickersoft. I'm also joined on today's webcast with Bridget Fleming, who is our lead trainer. Today, we're going to focus on our Microsoft Project Tips and Tricks series, and we're going to look more at working with resources in Microsoft Project. After the webinar, you will receive an email with a copy of the recording and the slide deck so you can review. The line will not be open for questions, but you can type in your questions via the chat feature. So if you want to know more about Wickersoft and who we are today, we are a Microsoft joint venture that was founded in 2002. We provide consulting, business process outsourcing, managed services, and global support for staffing. We are a triple gold certified Microsoft partner. Less than 1% of partners ever have that designation. We're certified in project portfolio management, collaboration and content, and cloud productivity. From a project and portfolio management standpoint, we have a deep expertise in Project Online and Project Server. So we have a lot of experience helping organizations maximize their efficiency and technological advantage. We have a footprint all over North America and internationally. I will now hand off the webcast to Bridget Fleming. Bridget?
Thanks, Mike. Welcome, everyone. As Mike said, this is part of our Tips and Tricks series, and we set up this webinar series to cover some key elements from a process and best practices perspective. In the first session, we talked about what to do first when putting together your project. We covered things like schedule management planning and initiating your project. In the second session, we talked about how to determine how long your project will take by looking at linking, task flows, and estimating. So today we're going to talk about how to get the work done on the project. So we're going to be talking about working with resources and various topics related to that. The format for this webinar is that I'm going to be going through some explanation of the topics using some slides for discussion, and then I'll demonstrate the functionality that I cover. We'll also have some specific spots where I stop for questions. So like Mike said, just type your questions in. When we stop and take the break, he'll let me know if there are questions and I can then answer them, hopefully. I'm going to be working today in Project 2016 desktop for our session. However, what we're discussing applies to Microsoft Project Desktop in earlier versions, as well as to Project Pro with Project Online or Project Server. There are a couple of places where if you're working with Project Online or Project Server, things are a little bit different, and I'll point those out as we go. So just a little quick background on me. I've been in project management for over 30 years, been working with Microsoft Project for more than 20 of those. So ever since way back in Project 3.0, prior to when they started naming them after the years. I've also been working with Project Server and Project Online for a little over 10 years. Project Online, obviously, more recently. I also ran a help desk for 15 years for a Fortune 100 company. We supported Microsoft Project and initially a custom enterprise scheduling system, and then later helped them implement Project Server. I also had the opportunity to serve as a member of the international core team that developed the PMI practice standard for scheduling 2nd edition, and actually I'm serving right now as the chair for the committee developing the 3rd edition. So we just got started about 2 months ago. So that publication will come out later next year, probably. My background is very process focused, and you'll see that that is how we'll be covering our topics today. Today we're going to focus on working with resources. We'll start off by covering the resource planning process, and then we'll talk about how to implement those processes in Microsoft Project. We'll look at defining resource availabilities, assigning resource requirements to individual tasks, and then analyzing our resource requirements and comparing those to our availabilities. And then finally, we'll look at leveling resources to try to level out any overallocations that we have in our project. Resource planning helps us to define what kinds of resources we need, how many of each kind we need, and during what time frame we need them. And then we're able to compare that to the resources that we have available to determine if we have enough of the right resources at the right time to do the work that we've defined for our project. Resources are the things we need to do the work on the project. So they include things like labor, which are the people we need to perform the tasks. Labor resources are usually managed in one of two ways. They are either managed as generics, and by that what I mean are things like design engineer, graphic artist, senior engineer, and those types of things. Or they can also be managed as named resources, so by individual names. If you're working with Project Online or Project Server and using the timesheet or task statusing option, you will be working with named resources. In a lot of organizations, they work with both. So projects will be planned early on with generic resources. What type of resource do I need on this task? And then once the team is built, those generic resources can get replaced with people's actual names. There's also material resources. So material resources are things like wire, metal, concrete. These are things that get actually consumed by the project. Equipment is another type of resource. This would be things like test sets, cranes, antennas. Equipment is used by a task and then available for use again by another task. And then facilities. So for facilities, what I mean are things like buildings and test chambers. Most projects don't need to manage facilities as a resource. It really comes into play when you have some kind of specialized resources. I worked with a company for a number of years that built communication satellites, and each of their satellites had to go through testing in some special test chambers. So these were some facility resources that the company managed in their schedules. When they first started working with project, this was the only type of resource they were managing. It was really their bottleneck in the organization. A resource pool identifies the resources that are available, and a resource pool can exist at two different levels. So we have a resource pool at the enterprise level, which represents all the resources that are available across the organization. And then we have resources that are available to the project, so resources that have been designated for use in the project. The term resource pool is a general term in project management, and you won't see that term referenced in Microsoft Project Desktop. However, in Project Online and Project Server, there is something called the Enterprise Resource Pool. And the Enterprise Resource Pool is what holds the resources for the entire organization. In Project Online and Project Server, the resource pool is managed by the Project Online administrator, centrally managed, and all of the information is managed by them. If you're working with the desktop, you will be creating your resource, entering your resource availability information into your project. And that's going to be entered into what we call the resource sheet. So we'll be taking a look at that. There's 6 main steps in the resource planning process. So the first is to define our resource availabilities or resource pool. So these are the resources that we're going to be assigning to tasks in our project. The next is to look at each individual task in our project and determine what resources are needed in order to perform that task. Next, we'll aggregate or sum up the resource requirements across time, and we can look at them in various time buckets. We'll compare our availability to our requirements and determine where we have disconnects, so where we have too much resource or not enough resource at various points in our project. From there, we can try to level out our resources, and then if we still don't have enough resources, even after we've tried to level things out, we may need to go back and try to get additional resources. If we're not able to get additional resources, then we do need to take a look at how that's going to impact our schedule. We need to adjust our schedule accordingly, and we need to communicate that with all the key stakeholders for our project. So step number 1, our resource availabilities. So Microsoft Project, there are 3 different resource types that can be defined. There are work resources, which is the type we use for people and equipment. Excuse me. So work resources are used by a task, and then they're available for use by another task. So both people and equipment fall into that definition. There are also material resources, and as I mentioned, these are consumable items. So when a task uses these type of resources, that particular resource is not available for use by another resource. It gets used up by the task. And then finally, there's also cost type resources. You can create expense or budget cost resources. We won't be covering these today, but we'll hopefully talk about these in a future session. Excuse me. So this is an example of what the resource sheet looks like. So as a desktop user, you will be actually entering all of the information into your resource sheet. For Project Online and Project Server users, they actually copy resources from the enterprise resource pool and put them into their resource sheet. So in both cases, the information has to be in the resource sheet before those resources can be assigned to tasks. So I want to just talk about a couple of the key fields here in your resource sheet. The first is the resource name. So this just has to be a unique name that represents the resource. As you can see here, all of the resources that I have defined in this particular resource sheet are actually generic resources. In your situation, you may have some people's names included as well. The resource type, so we have some material resources and some work resources. In this particular resource sheet, we don't have any cost resources defined. This next column, the material label. So any of my material resources, I can assign a material label, and it's really just text that helps me understand what the unit of measure is for that particular material resource. So in this example, it's for carbon fiber. So what this means is that if I say this particular task needs 2 carbon fibers, what I'm really meaning is 2 pounds. So this is an optional value that you can put in, but it just helps clarify things. The max units will show us the maximum amount of a resource that's available. So what you'll see is that only work resources have a max units. And the way this value works is if I see a value that says 100%, what that means is I have 100% of one resource's time available for the project. If I see something greater than 100, that means I have multiple resources. So in this example, for this project, I have 2 cyclists that have been assigned to work on my project. You may also see times where you have a max units that's less than 100%. So if you've been given half-time, someone's support half-time on your project, then the max units that you would want to use would be 50%. The next few columns have to do with cost and rates, which we won't be covering today. The last one I want to mention is the base calendar. So every resource that gets created in your project has a calendar associated with them. We'll talk about this a little bit more. But this enables you to identify what the work schedule is for a particular resource if it's different than the standard. Once we have all of the resources defined in our resource sheet, the next step is to define the requirements for each of the tasks in our project. So each task needs to be reviewed to determine the resources that are needed to perform the work. In many cases, or most cases really, you may not need to assign a resource to work full-time on a task. So you can assign what we call a partial resource. So I can assign a resource to a task to work on that task 25% of their time. Or I can assign a resource to a task and specify that that resource is going to be assigned on that task, and we want to assign 20 hours of work for that resource on that task. And we'll be taking a look at how to do this and some things about it. As I mentioned, each resource that's created has a calendar automatically defined for it, and you're able to modify the calendars to reflect vacations and time off if desired for individuals. Keep in mind that this increases your maintenance significantly, so only do that if you need that level of granularity. In Project Online and Project Server, the resources and the resource calendars are all managed centrally, and your organization will make a decision about how they want to reflect time off and how that's shown and whether that's shown. As a best practice, resources should only be assigned to detailed tasks. Detailed tasks are the actual work that's being performed. In one of the earlier sessions, we talked about detailed tasks as actions. So these are the things that you're doing to produce all of your deliverables. So that's where your resources are needed. Resources shouldn't be assigned to summary tasks, and they shouldn't be assigned to milestones. There's a formula in Project. This is a formula that Project will maintain consistent. So what that means is whenever I start working with resources, the duration times units equals work formula will come into play. So duration is the span of time that the resource is going to be working. Units is the percent of time for that resource that they'll be working on the task. So for example, when I said I could assign the resource at 25%. And then work is actually the total work hours for that resource on that task. So this is a formula that project will maintain constant throughout your project. If you change one of the values in this formula for a specific resource assignment, then project will change another one of the values to maintain the balance in the formula. Tasks are calculated based on the values in two task fields. So these come into play when we start talking about maintaining the balance in this formula. The first is the type field. People refer to it as task type, but it's actually called type. And the second is the effort-driven field. The type field can have one of three different values. Type could be set to fixed duration, fixed work, or fixed units. Whatever one we select for this, project's going to hold that constant and will not change it. So when we think about the formula that we just looked at on the previous slide, if I'm working with, for example, a fixed duration task, if I change the work, project will change the units because I fixed the duration. So whichever one of these values that I fix, project's going to hold that constant, and then when I change one of the other values, it's going to calculate the third, okay? The second task level field that comes into play is called effort driven, and this is actually a flag field. So this can either be set to yes or to no. And I tell people to think about the effort driven field as if you're asking the question, do I want the resources to share the work? So what I mean by that is once I have an amount of work on a task, if I add another resource to that task, what do I want to have happen? Do I want them to share that original amount of work, or does that mean I actually need more work on the task? So that's how you can think about the effort-driven flag field. Dependent on the type that you set, this will determine, as I mentioned, what project's going to recalculate when you make a change. So this slide, this table is showing you what gets recalculated. And I'm not going to go through, every single example in detail, but and you will get a copy of these slides. So you'll have this table, and then there's another one on the next slide that you'll see. But what this is intended to do is really just help you understand what makes sense for me. So for example, let's say I set my task as fixed duration. If I then say that, okay, I originally had this person working on this task at 25%, but now I'm going to change the units and have them work on it 50%, what's going to happen? And in that particular case, the work is going to be recalculated. So the work is going to get increased in the example I just gave you, because instead of working 25% on that task, the resource is now going to work 50%. So this table is intended to kind of help you understand as you make changes, whether you're changing units, duration, or work, what is going to be recalculated. And as I mentioned, whatever one of these values you fix, project won't change that. It's going to change one of the other two values. So for fixed work, notice it's either going to change the duration or the units. For fixed units, it changes duration or work. So we're holding one of those firm. The one that you select, and you can have different tasks in your project with different task types. Typically in most projects, the majority of the tasks will be one task type, but you may have a handful of tasks that are a different task type. And it really depends on a number of things. So it depends on how you get your estimates. How are you getting estimates from your team members? Are they giving you a span of time? Are they saying I can have that task done in 2 weeks because I can only work on it 25% of my time? Or are they just saying things like, well, this is going to take 40 hours, but I can only work on it half time? So one of the things to consider when you're trying to figure out what task type makes the most sense for you is, how do I get my estimates? And then from there, what you want to do is look at and work with this particular table and these values and try things out and say, okay, when I put this information in and then I change, for example, duration, what's happening? When I change work, what's happening? And what makes sense and what am I expecting? Sometimes I'll hear people say that, you should use this or you should use that. I tend to back away from that because I think it really depends on your environment. It depends on the maturity level of your organization from the standpoint of estimating and building schedules. So there are a lot of things that come into play. And I'm actually going to do, when I get to the demonstration piece, I'm actually going to run through a pretty quick, but a demonstration of how these are different when I make changes. So you'll get a chance to see that at work. This next table brings in the flag field that I mentioned, the effort driven. So effort driven only comes into play when you add an additional resource to a task. So if I only assign one resource on a task, I'm going to actually get the same, in terms of the assignment, I'm going to get the same result regardless. But when I start adding additional resources, that's where this effort driven flag comes into play. So for my 3 possible task types that I can have, fixed duration, fixed work, and fixed units, what this table shows you are the different combinations that can exist. So both fixed duration and fixed units can have the effort-driven flag set to either yes or no. Fixed work, the effort-driven flag will always be set to yes, and you can't change it. So fixed work will always, if you have a fixed work task and you add an additional resource, that second resource will always share whatever work is already on that task with the original resource. So what this table is intending to show you is what happens when I add another resource, depending on how I have these values set up. So again, think about the effort driven is, do I want the resources to share the work? So you notice for fixed duration, yes, fixed work, yes, and fixed units, yes. In all 3 cases, the work is going to be spread across the resources and something else will change. So for fixed duration, it's going to change the percentage of assignment to that resource. For fixed work and fixed units, it's going to recalculate the duration. So again, just kind of some hints for how to think about what these values mean and what they're doing. Okay. All right. So here's my recommended best practice having to do with task types. Again, there's not a right or wrong answer for what type to choose. What's really most important is that you use what works best in your environment and what gives you the results that you are expecting. So my recommendation is to create 1 or 2 test projects, and I actually have 2 little test projects we're going to look at in the demo. But create some test projects and go through some scenarios. Just say, okay, what if I add, a resource to all of these? What happens? And what if I change this? Does it give me the results that I'm expecting, that I want to have happen when I make that change? And that's how you really can go about making the decision about what is the correct type for your project or for your tasks. We need to go through each of the tasks in our project and assign resources. So again, we're going to go through each of the detailed tasks one by one and say, okay, what are the resources that I need to work on this task? And they're going to assign those resources, and it could be a partial assignment. So there are really 2 kind of recommended, what I would call recommended ways to assign resources. I'm actually going to show you 3 different ways, and then I'm going to warn you about the 3rd one, okay? I mention it because people run across it, and I just want to make sure that you understand what's happening. So the first recommended method is using what's called the Assign Resources dialog box. And the Assign Resources dialog box is accessed under the resource ribbon by selecting Assign Resources. And what that's going to do is it's going to present a dialog box that looks like this. And it's going to include a list of all of the resources that currently exist in your resource sheet, okay? So what you would do is you would select 1 or more tasks in your project, and then you would come into the Assign Resources dialog box, and you would specify what percentage of resource is going to be assigned to that task or tasks. So I can assign multiple tasks at a time if I want, or a single task. So I can just go through, and for this one, maybe I said design engineer 100%, and maybe that task also needed a carbon fiber tech at 25%. So I can assign multiple resources to a task or tasks as well. The second recommended method is using something called the task entry view. And the task entry view is your split screen where you have the Gantt chart on the top and the task form on the bottom. And this is accessed under the view ribbon by clicking the checkbox next to details, and I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. But what this is going to do for us is it's going to give us the Gantt on the top, and then down on the bottom, we're going to be able to specify what resources are going to be assigned to whatever task we currently have selected. Now with the task entry view, we can only only assign resources to one task at a time. So I would click up here in my Gantt chart, and then whatever I'm working at down here on the bottom is specific to that particular task. So I can click on a blank cell here. It'll give me a pick list of everything that's in my resource sheet, and I can select the resource that I want. And from here, I can either, again, specify the number of units, so the percentage, or I can also here enter a total number of work, total number of hours that that resource is going to be working on that task. And what Project will do, if I specify a total amount of work, it will take that work and spread it across the span of the task. This is the third method that I just wanted to mention to you, and I just want to kind of warn you and make sure you understand what it's doing. So if I click in the resource names column, so if I click next to one of my tasks into the resource name cell for that task, I can actually get this pull down list here. And again, this is going to show me a list of all of the resources that exist in my project, all the resources I've added to my resource sheet. So what I can do at that point is I can just go through here and I can click next to the resources that I want to assign to the task. The warning that I want to give you is just be aware that this is assigning those resources at 100%. There's no way to assign them using this method at anything different than 100%. You can go back and change it later, but it's just extra work. So if you're going to be assigning resources to tasks and you're not going to always be assigning at 100%, I recommend you avoid this approach. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go into the demo. I'm going to bring up a project here. Let me get to it. Here we go. So the first thing I want to do is just show you how to get to the resource sheet and how to enter information there. So this is just a project that I have that I've entered all my tasks into, linked everything up, everything's good to go. I've done all my validations. To get to the resource sheet is actually just a view. So what I can do is I can right click over here in the where it says Gantt chart, and on my pick list I can select resource sheet. And that's going to bring me into a view that looks like this. Now this particular project, I already have entered 3 resources into my resource sheet. Again, if I'm working with Project Online or Project Server, I'm going to pick these resources rather than enter them. And I do that by coming in here under Resources, Add Resources, and I use this option called Build Team from Enterprise. But since I'm working in the desktop today, I actually entered in all of this information myself. So if I need to add an additional resource, I just click on a blank space here, a blank cell. And what I do at this point is I start by typing in a name. And if the resource that I'm entering is a work resource, that's the only thing that I actually have to enter. The default type is going to be work, and it's going to default to a max units of 100%. So if that's the only information that I need, then I'm done. If I want to enter a resource that is instead, for example, a material type resource, I would type in the resource name. I would change the type to material. Notice what happens is it takes away the max units value. So I can't specify a max units here. But what I could do is I could specify a material, this is material label for the concrete. So I could say, I don't know how you measure concrete. Let's say square yards. So what that would mean is that when I specify that I need 3 concretes on a task, it's really meaning that I need 3 square yards. So it's just a way for me to more easily understand what that information is representing. Once I have all the resources entered into my resource sheet, I'm then ready to start assigning the resources to tasks in my project. So I'm going to go back to my Gantt chart. And I want to look at the two different ways that I mentioned for entering resources, the two recommended ways. So the first one is going to be using the resource assignment dialog box. So I would just select a task, I go in under the resource ribbon, and I select the Assign Resources button. What that's going to do is it's going to bring up this Assign Resources dialog box, and I can start assigning resources to my tasks. So I can click on a single task and specify a resource for that task just by typing in a percentage, clicking Assign. And what project's going to do is it's going to assign that resource at that percentage to that task. If I select a task, select a resource, and just click Assign, what it's going to do is it's going to, by default, it's going to assign it at the percentage, at the max units percentage from the resource sheet. So in this case, that's going to be 100% because that was the max units that were available. What you'll see here is the resources that I've entered. If I just see a resource name, what that means is that the assignment units is 100%. If it's anything other than 100%, I'll actually see a percentage next to the name. This is also what I'll see in the resource names column. So if I display that column, I'll see that same information. I can use the Assign Resources dialog box to assign resources to more than one task at a time if I want to do that. So let's say I have a group of tasks that all need 25% of the project manager's time. So what I can do is I can select all of those tasks. I can come in here under the project manager, click on units, type in 25, and click Assign. And what project's going to do is it's going to assign that project manager at 25% across all of those tasks. And we'll talk about these little red guys in a little while. So I have the ability to assign a single task to a single resource, multiple tasks to a single resource, or I could also go in for these same tasks and now say, oh, I also need a software analyst on those tasks at 20% of their time. And I'll see that added, okay? So that's the Assign Resources dialog box. And the benefit of using this approach is that it's pretty quick. I can go back and forth from my Gantt chart into my dialog and just switch back and forth without having to open and close things. One of the downsides is I'm not able in this way to assign specific work hours. So we'll take a look at the task entry view in order to do that. Okay, so we're going to come out of this one. I'm going to go ahead and split my screen so that we can work with the task entry view. And the way I do that is under my view ribbon, there's a checkbox here called Details. And Details is going to split my screen for me. There are other ways I can split my screen, but this is typically the simplest way to do it. So what we'll see here is that for whatever task I have selected, I'm going to see information about that task in this bottom pane. So I've currently clicked on the Determine Project Scope task. So everything that I see here is information about that task. So in order to assign a resource to that task, what I can do is I can click on the resource name, click on the pull down, select the resource, and I can then type in either a units value or a work value for how much of that resource's time I need. Project will then calculate whatever I don't assign, and it will assign that resource to the task. If I have more than one resource that I want to assign, I just go to the next blank space, select the resource, and assign it. Okay. So, excuse me, the benefit, the thing I like about this approach, excuse me, is a couple things. Number one, it gives me visibility to a lot of information at one time. And I tend to, when I'm working in project, I like to see a lot of information. I always tell people I'm kind of a data pig. I like to see lots of columns. I like to see lots of information. So this allows me to do that. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't allow me to assign resources to more than one task at a time. So I have to actually do them on an individual task by task basis. So there are pros and they're really kind of pros and cons to both approaches. So one of the things I do want to mention though, excuse me, sorry, is one of the things that will happen with the task entry view. So I'm going to come down here to this task that doesn't have any resources assigned at this point. And I'm going to go in here and I'm going to say, okay, I need a data analyst on here. And this is a 10-day task, but I really only need 40 hours of that data analyst time. Now, I'm working in this particular example, all of my tasks are fixed duration. Okay, so just keep that in mind, fixed duration and not effort driven. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say this data analyst is going to work on this 10-day task. They've told me it's going to take me 10 days to do this task, and I'm going to be, but it's going to only take me 40 hours of work. Okay, so instead of typing in a percentage of time, I'm going to type in a work value, and I'm going to click OK. Now, I want to point out something that can be really confusing and really misleading. Notice that it took those 40 hours, but in my percentage, in my units cell, it actually says 100. Now, if I take 40 hours and spread them across 10 days, that's not 100%. This value that I see here is something called assignment unit. So there are two different kinds of units fields down at the resource assignment level. There's assignment units and peak. Assignment units is the value that I can change, and project will not recalculate it. Peak units is the value that project will actually recalculate based on information that I provide. So what I want to do is I'm going to actually, just for a minute here, I'm going to change this top view from the Gantt chart into something called the task usage view. The task usage view is a view that will show me all of the tasks in my project, just like a regular Gantt chart. But for each task, it also shows me all the resources that are assigned. So here we have 2 resources assigned to this task. Here we have 1 resource assigned, and this is actually the one that I just assigned. We're going to talk later on about this part of the view, but I want to just mention one other thing right now. So what I want to do here is I'm going to actually insert those 2 different assignment units that I mentioned. So I mentioned there's one that's actually called assignment units, and that's the one that we are looking at. Go back to the right task. That's the one that we're looking at here, okay? So we're seeing that 100%. The other units field is called peak. So if I insert the peak field, what we're going to see is the real assignment of that resource on that task. So the 40 hours spread across the 10 days is really 50%. So the point of my story, to make try to make a long story short, is that this unit's value is the one that I can change. But if I change this value, let's say I now change it to 20 hours, project's not going to touch this, but what it will recalculate is the peak value. And this is what project's really looking at to determine whether we have enough resources to do the work. So when it compares requirements to availabilities, it's using that peak value. So just be aware of that, and just be really careful about putting any meaning to this if you're entering work hours in. I can change the value here. So now if I come in here and change this to 50, project will let me change the assignment units. When I do that, it's going to actually recalculate the peak units, okay? So there's just this interplay with these 2 units fields that you need to be aware of. Assignment units, again, is the one that you can change. By default, project's going to use whatever's in the max units field in the resource sheet. And peak is the one that project's going to calculate. So this is really the one that you want to be most interested in, most concerned with, okay? All right. Let me see, what else? Okay, so the next thing I want to do in this demo is I want to show you the two examples that I have of the task type demo and the effort-driven demo. So let me find it here. Here's the task type one. Okay. So what I've done here is I've just created 3 tasks in my project. I'm in that same task usage view that we were just in. So right now I have tasks with no resources assigned to them. They're all the same duration. We have one that's fixed duration, one that's fixed work, and one that's fixed units. And I actually gave them the task name that's the same as their type. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at how these differ when I make changes to them. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to add a resource to all 3 of these tasks, a single resource. So I'm going to go in under my resource, assign resources dialog, and I'm just going to say, okay, I want to go ahead and assign the design engineer to all of those tasks. So what that's going to do is it's going to, let me scroll over so we can see something here. Okay. So what it's actually done is, if you notice, all 3 of these tasks have the same information in them right now. So if I'm just assigning for the first time a resource to a task, it really doesn't matter what the task type is, okay? So now let's take a look here at what happens when I change something. Okay, so this right now is the 5-day task. Each of the tasks has 40 hours of resource assigned to it, spread evenly across. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change the percentage, and what I can change is this is my assignment units and this is my peak units. Remember, this is the one I can change. This is the one that project will recalculate. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to change this for each of these different resources assigned to these tasks with different task types. So as I change them, we'll see the difference in what happens. This was a fixed duration. I changed the units. It recalculated work. For the fixed work task, it didn't change the work. What it changed instead was the duration. For the fixed units, what it's going to change is, again, the duration. So again, the takeaway is that as I change different values, project is going to recalculate something, and I need to make sure I know and am happy with what it's recalculating. So I'm going to undo those changes for a second. So we're back to everything being the same. And the next thing I'm going to do is go through and change the duration for each of them. And we'll take a look at what happens differently when I change the duration. So in each case, I changed the duration to 10, okay? Notice for the fixed duration and the fixed units task, what it did was it actually added additional work. So it left the assignment at the same and then calculated, okay, if it was 8 hours a day, used to be for 5 days, so it was 40 hours, now it's 10 days, so it's 80 hours. But notice for the fixed work task, what that did instead was it said, well, I can't change the work. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to change the units, okay? So let me take those off again and just look at the third different value that I can change, which is the work. So now I'm going to go in and I'm going to change the work on each of these to 80 hours. And again, we're going to see different results, okay? So again, fixed duration, it's not going to change the duration. So what it's done is it's recalculated this peak. So if I have to do 80 hours of work in 5 days, I'm working at 200%. These other two, what they changed was actually the work value, okay? So again, just trying to give you some sense of the difference between these different task types and how they work. And again, the recommendation is to try it out. Play around with these and see what works best for you. And I'm happy to, when you get the copy of the slideshow, if you want these 2 projects, I'm happy to provide them for you. So I'm just going to show you this other one. I'm not going to go through the whole step, but what I did with this second project is, this is the one that has the task type and the effort driven both incorporated. So again, in this one, where things start getting different is when I start adding a second resource. So when I assign the first resource, everything is the same. Nothing's different between these these tasks. But it's when I assign the second resource to the tasks that things start getting different. And that's really the thing that, you want to understand, okay? All right. So again, so you're welcome to these projects. Just request it when you get the slides, and I'm happy to forward them to you. Okay, Mike, any questions at this point, or Victoria, who's ever's manning questions?
Hi, Bridget. I don't see any questions at this time, no.
Okay, all right, well, we'll continue on. So next, what I want to talk about is kind of now what happens. So once we've assigned the resources, by definition, because the tasks have a schedule associated, the resources now have a schedule associated with them as well. So what I'm able to do then is I'm able to aggregate or sum up the resource requirements that I have across different time periods. So we were looking at the task usage view. This is something called the resource usage view. And the resource usage view has a list of all the resources from your resource sheet, and then it will show each of the tasks that they're assigned to. So I've actually collapsed all these ones on the top so we're not seeing their tasks, but underneath each of those would also show the tasks. So this is showing, for example, the marketing manager, all of the tasks that the marketing manager is assigned to. And when we see red with resources, that's bad. It means it's over allocated. So what we can see here is we can start to look over here in this spreadsheet type area, if you will, and understand what the time frames are for where those resources are over allocated. We're going to be comparing our availability to our requirements. So this is just an example of a bar chart or a histogram. This is not straight out of Project, but Project has a kind of similar one. So I just want to talk to sort of the concept of resource overloads and resource underloads. So this is my project. I have a 5-week project. I've been given 3 technicians for the span of my project. So that's my availability line. It's this green line here at 3 that shows me these are the resources that I have available. The pink line is representing my requirements. So this is the information based on the tasks that I have scheduled during certain time frames and the resources that I've assigned to those tasks. So when we compare the requirement to the availability, we have some disconnects. We have some resource overloads and we have some resource underloads. So the resource overloads is where we have more requirement than we have availability. Resource underloads is where we have more availability than we have requirement. If I do nothing and I just start work on my project, as soon as I get to week 2, I don't have enough resources to do the work, so things are going to start slipping. We also want to be aware of resource underloads, because what this means is that we've got more resources than we need, so we have resources with no work to do. So what we want to do at this point is we want to try to level things out. And when we level things out, what this is it's rescheduling the tasks based on resource constraints as well as based on their links. So when we do leveling, the goal is to eliminate, ideally, but typically minimize the over allocations based on what we specify. Project allows you to do automated leveling. To use the automated leveling function, the first thing that you're going to do is set the leveling options. And then you can specify whether you want to level everything, level just one or a couple of specific resources if you have some key critical resources that you want to level based on those resources, or you can level just a specific group of tasks. The best practice recommendation we have here is to use automated leveling with caution. And I used to actually tell people don't use automated leveling. But what I do now is I typically use it as kind of a what if. So I will try different scenarios to see what the results are. The reason you want to be careful with automated leveling is that project will not always make the same decisions that you would make as a project manager. So for example, if I have 1 hour of over allocation for a resource on a specific week in my schedule, what project will do is it will try to level that out. If I tell it to level, it's going to push things out to take care of that. As a project manager, what I would likely do is I would go to that resource and say, we've got a problem, can you work an extra hour during this particular week or whatever, and we can make it up in another way. So just know that projects, only going to make decisions based on the information that it has. There are two main ways of resource leveling in project. The first, which is what project does by default, is what I refer to as resource limited. And these are my terms, so you're not going to see these terms. But resource limited basically means go ahead and push things out as far as you need to, move my tasks as much as you need to in order to get rid of all of the over allocations. The only time you would have over allocations in this kind of a scenario is if you have a resource that was assigned to a single task at a percentage greater than its max units. Project can't take care of that. The other type of leveling is what I refer to as time-limited leveling. In time-limited leveling, tasks will only be delayed within their total slack. So what that means is that the project end date won't get pushed out, but tasks will be moved around to try to level out the resource over allocations. And the way that you specify what you want project to use, whether you want resource limited or time limited, is based on this option in the leveling options. So the checkbox says level only within available slack. That's saying don't push out my end date. I want you to do a time limited scheduling or time limited leveling. If I uncheck this, then the project's going to push things out as far as it needs to in order to find the resources it needs, and it'll push the project out past the due date. Once I've done my leveling, a great way to look at the results is using the leveling Gantt view. So this shows me a lot of information. It shows me a little brown or a thick brown bar, I guess, or grayish brown bar. It shows me what the original start and finish dates were for the task. The blue bar shows me what the new dates are based on the leveling that I've just done. And then the skinny gray bar shows me a value called leveling delay. The leveling delay field, which is inserted as part of that view, represents the number of days, and it's actually in elapsed days, so it's not based on a calendar, it's just calendar days. So it's the number of days that the task had to be delayed in order to find the resources that it needed. Once I've done my leveling, if I still have over allocations, then I need to figure out what my over allocations are, what I still need, see if I can get more resources during those particular time frames. And then if not, I need to modify my schedule to reflect the resources that I actually have. So if I don't have enough resources and I can't change my scope, the schedule is going to change. And if I don't reflect that in my schedule, then I'm basically advertising and sharing something that I know is impossible to accomplish. Okay, so let's just take a look at some of the resource views that are available to you, and then also we'll look at the leveling real quick. So one of the things that I mentioned were these, what I refer to as the little red Burning Man. So if I have a project and I have resources assigned and I see these little red people in the indicator column, what that tells me is that that task has one or more resources assigned that is over allocated during the time period that that task is taking place. Okay, so this is really just a very high level indicator that I need to go do something and go look at this a little bit deeper. So one of the things that we looked at was the resource usage view, and I find this to be really probably the best way to take a look at this information. Because it really gives me a lot of, it gives me a lot of detail. So again, it's going to show me each of the resources that exist on my resource sheet, and it's going to show me all of the tasks that that resource is assigned to. This is where I can also add my peak units if I want to. I'm going to scroll over so that I can actually see information. And what I can start doing is I can start looking for the details of where these over allocations are. So I have 3 resources in this resource sheet. 2 of them are over allocated, project manager and software analyst, and the software engineer is not. Okay, that's why his the resource name is not in red. So I can start looking at the resources that are over allocated and understand the time frames of the over allocation and which tasks are actually causing those over allocations. Over here in this area, in the graph area, or in the spreadsheet area, I can add additional rows of information to help me with my analysis. And the way I do that is if I just right-click over here in this area, I get a list of potential fields that I can add. I can also go in under detail styles and access any of the resource related fields that I want. So if I wanted to actually look at my peak units during each time period, I can insert peak units, and now I'm looking at the work and the peak units during each of those time periods. Now currently I'm looking at it on a daily basis, but I can actually zoom out and look at it with less granularity. Let's say I'm doing some planning in the future and I only want to look at it more on a weekly basis. I can kind of see what my peak units are on a weekly basis. So again, I can zoom in and zoom out to change the time buckets that I'm looking at. But this resource usage view is really a great one to help you drill in on the details of what problems are in your resource assignments. So I also mentioned leveling. So let's just go take a look at leveling. I get to the leveling topics, the leveling options, buttons, if you will, under the resource ribbon. So as I mentioned, the first thing I need to do is I need to go into my leveling options. And I want to just point out a couple of these. For the most part, you can just leave them as default. You definitely want to leave this as manual. By default, we're going to look for over allocations on a day-by-day basis. If I'm doing some real long-term planning and I just want a rough idea of how my resources look compared to my availabilities, I could do a week-by-week analysis. And what that means is if I have a resource and that resource is assigned 40 hours of work in a given week, and that resource has 40 hours of availability in a given week, that resource will not show over-allocated, even if 20 of those hours are on Monday. Okay, so the level of granularity that project's going to do its comparisons at is controlled here. Always leave this one checked. I can either level the entire project or a specific time period. If I have a 3-year project, I probably don't want to bother leveling things that are out, 9 months beyond from here, because things are going to change. So I may just want to level a certain time period of my project. Leveling order. So by default, it's going to use standard, which is going to look at things like total slack and duration and those kinds of things. There's also a field called priority. It's a task level field. So I can give specific tasks higher priorities in order to have them get resources first. Everything by default is set at 500, but if I give a particular task or set of tasks a higher number, if there's a conflict, those tasks are going to get the resource. ID only, I'm not sure why anyone would ever use that. I'm not sure what the point is. This is the one that we're going to specify whether it's resource limited or time limited. So the first thing we're going to do is just go ahead and let it level resource limited. So, or excuse me, time limited. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. I want to show you initially that I do have a target complete on my project of December 8th. And now when I do my leveling, what's going to happen is project's going to push out as far as it needs to find the resources that it needs. So this is a resource limited leveling, meaning we have no more resources. We're limited on our resources. So once I've checked all my leveling options, at this point I'm going to do a level all. And what I'll see is a lot of blue, change highlighting, and I will also see that my project has pushed out past my due date. So my due date is December 8th. My project is now not scheduled to finish until December 13th. So with a resource limited schedule, what project had to do was it had to push things out beyond their total slack. Notice that all of my red men are gone now. Now I'm going to show you the difference when I do a time limited schedule. Excuse me. So the only thing I'm going to change here is this checkbox. And that says only level within the available slack. So when I say okay here, and now I go and do my level, what's going to happen is all my red men are back because I unleveled. I cleared the previous leveling. Okay, so we're starting from scratch. Now I'm saying, okay, I only want you to level within the slack in my project. And actually, let me open up I'll insert the total slack field so we can watch it happen. Okay. So at this point, I'm ready to do my leveling. I click level all. And it's going to start giving me some messages that it can't resolve the over allocations. And it's because I've said you can't go as far as you want. You can only go out within the slack. So at this point, I could just say, go ahead and skip all. Excuse me. What's going to happen is, again, we have a lot of things that have moved, but notice they haven't moved beyond the due date. Okay, so it's held, and it has not taken me into a negative slack situation, which is where I got before with the resource limited leveling. So notice I still have 2 additional red men that I need to go and resolve. So by limiting that within the time, I still have some over allocations. So those are really kind of my 2 options of overall of leveling. I'm going to clear the leveling again, and I'm going to jump back in here and just show you how the total slack went negative previously. This is I'm going to redo that very first level I did with the resource limited. Notice that it's actually showing me within the total slack that I've gone negative, so I can see that reflected that I've gone out past my due date. So it's kind of a trade-off between resource limited and time limited in terms of what you're going to end up with. Whether you can push out past your due date and potentially negotiate for a different due date or not. Okay? All right. Mike, any questions? I realize that was a pretty quick flurry through resources.
Right. I'm not seeing any questions on the panel. Bridget.
Okay. All right. So if you have any questions that come up, feel free to shoot us a note. Oh, I do want to just mention we actually have a combination e-learning ebook. We have actually 2 of them. We have one that's for Microsoft projects, so that's for folks using the desktop. And then we have one for Project Online for project managers. So it covers Project Pro, so the desktop kinds of things I was doing today, plus all the Project Online functionality. So if you're interested in finding out more about that, go to www.projectecademy.com, and you can look at some information. There's a video, and you can actually sign up for a trial and get access to some of the content. If you need anything, want anything, have any other questions, please feel free to shoot an email, and we are happy to answer any questions or help you with anything that we can. So thank you, and I apologize for going my 2 minutes over. Any wrap up, Mike?
Yep, that's it. We're good.
Okay. All right. Thank you all for being here. Hope to see you next time.